2,500 years ago, a city rose from the mudflats of Mesopotamia and dared to call itself the center of the universe. Its walls were said to be so thick that chariots could race along their tops. Its gate gleamed with blue glazed bricks and golden beasts. Its gardens, if they truly existed, seemed to defy gravity itself, cascading green above a desert horizon. This was Babylon, a name that would echo through scripture, legend, and empire long after its people vanished in a dust. But Babylon's story is not one of unbroken glory. It is a story of collapse and resurrection, repeated again and again, as if the city itself refused to die. It was burned to the ground by a furious Assyrian king who dumped its rubble into a river out of pure hatred. It rose again, more magnificent than before, under a ruler whose name would become synonymous with both grandeur and tyranny. It held the Hebrew people captive beside its canals, inspiring a lament that survives in scripture to this day. And on one fateful night, as a king feasted and drank from sacred vessels, an army was already diverting a river beneath the city's walls. What made Babylon so irresistible and so vulnerable? Why did it fall, rise, and fall again? And what really happened on the night its final king saw words appear on a palace wall that no one else could explain? This is the rise and fall of Babylon. Long before Babylon became an empire, it was little more than a name on a clay tablet, a modest settlement on the banks of the Euphrates River, in the fertile plain the Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers. This region, in what is now central Iraq, had already witnessed thousands of years of civilization by the time Babylon first appears in written records, during the last centuries of the 3rd millennium BCE. Sumerian and Akkadian cities had risen and fallen here before Babylon existed at all. Uruk, Akkad, Nippur, each leaving behind ziggurats, law codes, and the world's earliest writing system, cuneiform, pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus. Babylon's true rise began around the 20th century BCE, when a wave of Amorite peoples, nomadic Semitic-speaking groups from the Syrian steppe, moved into Mesopotamia and established a series of small kingdoms along the Euphrates. One of these Amorite dynasties took root in Babylon, then a minor city-state overshadowed by older, more powerful neighbors like Isin, Larsa, and Assyria to the north. For roughly a century, Babylon remained unremarkable, one voice among many competing for control of the region's canals, trade routes, and temples. Everything changed with the sixth king of this Amorite dynasty, Hammurabi, who ascended the throne around 1792 BCE and ruled for some 42 years. Hammurabi inherited a modest kingdom, but he possessed something rarer than territory: patience. For the first 2 decades of his reign, he consolidated his own domain, built temples, dug canals, and strengthened Babylon's fortifications, all while larger powers around him warred with one another. Only in the later years of his rule did he strike outward, using shifting alliances and calculated betrayals to defeat, one by one, the kingdoms of Larsa, Elam, Eshnunna, Mari, and eventually even Assyria itself. By the end of his reign, Hammurabi had unified nearly all of Mesopotamia under Babylonian rule for the first time in the city's history. Hammurabi's most enduring legacy, however, was not conquest but law. Near the end of his reign, he commissioned a monumental stele of black diorite, nearly 7 feet tall, inscribed with 282 legal provisions covering property, marriage, labor, theft, and personal injury. At its top, a carved relief shows Hammurabi receiving symbols of authority from Shamash, the sun god and patron of justice. The Code of Hammurabi was not the first law code in Mesopotamian history. Earlier Sumerian codes predate it by centuries. but it survives as the most complete and became the clearest ancient expression of the principle that a ruler's power was bound to the maintenance of justice, however harsh that justice could be. Its famous provisions on retribution, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, still echo in modern discussions of law and punishment nearly 4,000 years later. Yet the empire Hammurabi built proved fragile. His successors struggled to hold together the vast territory he had unified, and within a few generations, Babylon's first empire had contracted dramatically, weakened by rebellions, the loss of outlying territories, and the slow decline of centralized authority. The final blow came around 1595 BCE, when a Hittite king, Mursili I, led a daring raid down the Euphrates from Anatolia, sacked Babylon, and toppled its ruling dynasty. The Hittites did not stay to rule. They returned home with their plunder, leaving a power vacuum that was soon filled by a new people entirely, the Kassites, who migrated into Mesopotamia from the Zagros Mountains to the east. The Kassite period, which lasted roughly 4 centuries, is often overlooked in popular history, yet it was an era of remarkable stability. Kassite kings adopted Babylonian culture, language, and religion almost entirely, positioning themselves as protectors and continuators of Babylonian civilization rather than foreign conquerors. Babylon during this era functioned as a respected diplomatic partner among the great powers of the Late Bronze Age, corresponding as an equal with Egypt's pharaohs, as preserved in the famous Amarna letters. But by the 12th century BC, the wider Bronze Age world was collapsing under pressures historians still debate: climate change, famine, migrations, and the mysterious sea peoples who destabilized the eastern Mediterranean. Babylon did not escape this turmoil. Elamite invaders from the east eventually toppled the Kassite dynasty, and for the following centuries Babylon entered a long period of political fragmentation, shifting between periods of local rule and domination by its increasingly powerful northern neighbor, Assyria. The relationship between Babylon and Assyria was one of the most fraught in ancient history. Two Mesopotamian civilizations sharing language, gods, and cultural heritage, yet locked in a rivalry that alternated between reverence and violence. Assyrian kings often treated Babylon with a strange mixture of respect and suspicion. Babylon was sacred to them, the ancient seat of Marduk, the chief god of the Mesopotamian pantheon, and a city no Assyrian king wished to be seen desecrating. Yet Babylon also remained a persistent source of rebellion, repeatedly rising against Assyrian overlordship. This tension reached its breaking point in 689 BCE under the Assyrian king Sennacherib. After Babylon rebelled once too often, Sennacherib responded with a fury unprecedented even by the brutal standards of ancient warfare. His armies besieged and captured the city, and rather than simply subduing it, Sennacherib ordered its systematic destruction. Temples were razed, the great ziggurat was toppled, and according to Assyrian royal inscriptions, the very rubble of the city was gathered and thrown into the Euphrates, its waters diverted to flood the ruins, erasing Babylon as though it had never existed. Sennacherib even claimed to have removed the statue of Marduk itself, an act of religious violence meant to symbolically annihilate the city's soul. But Babylon's destruction proved to be political poison even for the Assyrians. Sennacherib's own son and successor, Esarhaddon, initiated a program of rebuilding almost immediately after taking the throne, restoring temples and reinstating Marduk's statue, seemingly convinced that his father's sacrilege had brought a curse upon the Assyrian royal house. Babylon rose from its ashes once more, rebuilt under Assyrian patronage. Yet the underlying tension between the two cities never fully disappeared. The final collapse of Assyrian dominance came swiftly in the final decades of the 7th century BCE. In 626 BCE, a Chaldean leader named Nabopolassar seized the Babylonian throne and declared independence from a weakening Assyrian empire, an empire now strained by overextension, internal succession crises, and rebellion on multiple fronts. Nabopolassar allied with the rising Median kingdom to the east, and together their combined forces launched a devastating campaign against Assyria's heartland. In 612 BCE, the allied armies captured and utterly destroyed Nineveh, the magnificent Assyrian capital, an event so total that the city was never meaningfully reoccupied, and its very location was eventually forgotten until 19th century archaeologists rediscovered its ruins. The empire that had dominated the Near East for centuries collapsed within a few short years, and Babylon, once the frequent victim of Assyrian domination, now stood as the master of a new empire. The Neo-Babylonian, or Chaldean, empire was Nabopolassar's son, Nebuchadnezzar II, who would carry Babylon to the absolute peak of its power and fame. Ascending the throne in 605 BCE after a decisive victory over Egyptian forces at the Battle of Carchemish, Nebuchadnezzar ruled for 43 years, transforming Babylon into arguably the most magnificent city the ancient world had ever seen. He rebuilt and expanded the city's fortifications, constructing double walls so massive that later Greek historians, including Herodotus, described them in terms bordering on the mythical, even if modern archaeology suggests some of these accounts were exaggerated. He rebuilt the Great Ziggurat at Etemenanke, a soaring step tower dedicated to Marduk that many scholars believe inspired the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. Nebuchadnezzar's most iconic architectural achievement was the Ishtar Gate, the northern entrance to the inner city, covered in brilliant blue glazed bricks and decorated with rows of striding lions, bulls, and dragons rendered in golden yellow relief. This gate opened onto the processional way, a broad ceremonial avenue used during the New Year festival, when a statue of Marduk was carried through the city in a ritual reaffirming the king's divine mandate to rule. Nebuchadnezzar also gained lasting fame, whether deserved or not, for the legendary Hanging Gardens of Babylon, described by later Greek and Roman writers as a terraced paradise of exotic plants irrigated by an ingenious system that lifted water from the Euphrates. No definitive archaeological evidence of the gardens has ever been found at the site of Babylon itself, and some modern historians, notably the Assyriologist Stephanie Daly, have proposed that the gardens may actually have existed at Nineveh, built by the earlier Assyrian king Sennacherib, and that later writers simply confused the two cities. This remains one of the great unresolved debates of ancient history. Nebuchadnezzar's reign was not only one of architectural splendor, but also of military conquest and, for some, profound suffering. In a series of campaigns against the kingdom of Judah, culminating in 587 or 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar's forces captured Jerusalem, destroyed Solomon's temple, and deported thousands of Judah's population to Babylon in what became known as the Babylonian captivity. This exile left a permanent mark on Jewish religious and cultural identity, giving rise to some of the most haunting passages in Hebrew scripture, including the lament that begins, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, we wept when we remembered Zion." Ironically, this era of exile also coincided with a flourishing of Jewish religious thought and textual tradition, as scholars in Babylon began compiling and editing texts that would eventually form part of the Hebrew Bible. After Nebuchadnezzar's death in 562 BCE, Babylon's political stability began to erode rapidly. A succession of short-lived rulers followed, undermined by court intrigue and priestly opposition, until the throne eventually passed to Nabonidus in 556 BCE, a ruler whose reign remains one of the most curious and debated in Babylonian history. Nabonidus was not from the royal bloodline and appears to have come to power through a palace conspiracy. Once in power, he pursued religious policies that alienated Babylon's powerful priesthood. He showed particular devotion to Sin, the moon god of the city of Haran, elevating Sin's status in ways that many Babylonians saw as a direct affront to Marduk, the traditional patron deity of the capital. For reasons still debated by historians, ranging from religious conviction to political necessity to possible illness, Nabonidus spent nearly a decade of his reign away from Babylon entirely, residing at the desert oasis of Tema in the Arabian Peninsula, leaving the day-to-day governance of the empire to his son, Belshazzar. It is Belshazzar, who appears in one of the most famous stories associated with Babylon's downfall, immortalized in the biblical book of Daniel. According to this account, Belshazzar held a great feast, drinking wine from sacred vessels looted from the Jerusalem temple, when a disembodied hand appeared and wrote a cryptic message on the palace wall. Mean, tekel, a parson. The prophet Daniel, summoned to interpret the writing, declared that it foretold the end of Belshazzar's kingdom, judged and found wanting, soon to be divided between the Medes and Persians. Historians note that Belshazzar, as regent rather than official king, may not correspond precisely to the biblical narrative's details, and some question whether this dramatic feast occurred exactly as described, since it survives only in a religious rather than a contemporary royal or administrative source. What is not disputed, however, is the historical outcome the story foreshadows: the fall of Babylon to a new and formidable power rising in the east. That power was Persia, under Cyrus the Great, founder of the Achaemenid Empire. Cyrus had already unified the Median and Persian kingdoms and conquered the wealthy kingdom of Lydia in Anatolia, building a rapidly expanding empire that now bordered Babylonian territory on multiple fronts. In October of 539 BCE, Cyrus's forces moved against Babylon itself. According to ancient accounts, including the Nabonidus Chronicle and later Greek historians such as Herodotus, Persian engineers diverted the course of the Euphrates River, lowering the water level enough for soldiers to advance along the riverbed and beneath the city's formidable walls, entering Babylon with minimal resistance, reportedly during a festival when the city's defenses were lowered. Nabonidus, who had returned to Babylon by this point, was captured, and the ancient capital that had stood as the jewel of Mesopotamia fell into Persian hands with remarkably little bloodshed, at least according to the surviving records, which may themselves reflect propaganda favorable to Cyrus. Remarkably, Cyrus did not destroy Babylon as Sennacherib had done more than a century earlier. Instead, he presented himself as a liberator and restorer, respecting Babylonian religious institutions, honoring Marduk, and issuing what has come to be known as the Cyrus Cylinder, a clay artifact inscribed with a declaration allowing displaced peoples, including the exiled Jewish community, to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. This act, described in the book of Ezra as fulfilling a divine mandate, allowed a significant portion of the Judean exiles to return to Jerusalem and begin reconstructing the temple, bringing the Babylonian captivity to its formal end. Babylon itself did not vanish overnight. Under Persian rule, it remained an important administrative and cultural center for another 2 centuries, retaining much of its urban grandeur, even as political power now resided in Persepolis and Susa. The city experienced a final burst of historical prominence when Alexander the Great, having conquered the Achaemenid Empire, entered Babylon in 331 BCE and, struck by its magnificence, reportedly intended to make it the capital of his own vast empire. Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE, under circumstances historians still debate, whether from illness, poisoning, or a combination of exhaustion and disease, bringing an abrupt end to plans that might have restored the city to unprecedented glory. After Alexander's death, his empire fractured among his generals in the wars of the successors, and Babylon's fortunes declined steadily as new cities, particularly Seleucia on the Tigris, founded nearby by the Seleucid dynasty, drew away its population and economic significance. Over the following centuries, Babylon slowly emptied. Its temples fell into disrepair, and by the early centuries of the Common Era, the city that had once claimed to be the center of the world had become little more than scattered ruins amid the shifting sands of the Euphrates plain, visited occasionally by travelers and pilgrims who marveled at what remained of its walls. For nearly 2,000 years, Babylon existed primarily as legend, preserved in the Hebrew Bible and Greek historical writing, and in cultural memory as a byword for both magnificence and moral corruption. The origin of the phrase, the whore of Babylon, in Christian tradition and a symbol of imperial excess in Western thought. It was not until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that systematic archaeological excavation, led by the German archaeologist Robert Koldewey, beginning in 1899, began to uncover the physical reality beneath the legend, revealing the foundations of the Ishtar Gate, the outlines of the processional way, and the layout of Nebuchadnezzar's palace, allowing historians to finally separate documented fact from centuries of embellishment. Today, the site of ancient Babylon lies roughly 50 miles south of modern Baghdad. In Iraq, a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 2019, its mud brick ruins a fragile testament to a civilization that shaped the foundations of law, astronomy, mathematics, and religious thought across the ancient world. The code of Hammurabi's principles of codified justice, the Babylonian development of a sophisticated base 60 numerical system, still echoed in how we divide hours and minutes today. And the astronomical observations of Babylonian priests that laid groundwork for later Greek and Islamic science all trace their origins to this city on the Euphrates. Babylon rose from obscurity, fell to conquest, rose again in even greater splendor, and fell a final time, not through destruction, but through the slow, inevitable decline that awaits even the mightiest of ancient cities. Its walls are gone, its gardens remain a mystery, and its gate now stands reconstructed in a museum in Berlin, far from the river that once reflected its golden glory. Yet the name Babylon endures, carried forward in scripture, literature, and memory, long after the city itself returned to dust.